Hello everybody, welcome to this Climate Now Live here on Euronews YouTube channel. My name is Jeremy Wilkes. I make a monthly program on Euronews called Climate Now, giving you the latest data from the Copernicus Climate Change Service on how our planet's climate is changing and reporting from different parts of Europe on the effects of climate change and what we can do to adapt as well as reduce emissions. And we are here to answer your questions about extreme weather and climate change. And so please do send them through to us. We've got an amazing panel of guests. Let me start to introduce them. I would like to say we are very pleased to have IPCC co-chair of Working Group 1, Valérie Masson-Delmotte. She is a physicist and a climate scientist and right at the heart of that important report that you heard about this summer. We have Robert Votard, who is an IPCC Working Group 1 contributing author, a specialist in extreme weather events. We also have Samantha Burgess, who's the Deputy Director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, an expert in the intersection between climate policy and climate science. And we have the mayor of Athens, Kostas Bakoyannis, who's working to make the Greek capital a greener place to be, but also has been really on the front line of climate change with the heat waves that they've had this year and the fires. And as a reminder of what happened this year, we'd now like to show you a video, I think, before we get into our discussion, showing you some of the highlights of what's been happening around Europe. Let's have a look at that video now. So here we begin with Evia Island in Greece, where they had a wildfire burning for 10 days during one of the worst heat waves in decades. And then we have Germany in the Ahr Valley near the Eiffel Mountains. 192 people died when extremely heavy rain fell on already saturated land. Then in Madrid, they had a heat wave. And down near Cordoba, there was a possible new Spanish record of 47.2 degrees. 7,000 hectares of land burned in the Var department of France. Real destruction there in the south of France. Then in Alcanar in Spain, by the Ebro River Delta in Catalonia, they had flash floods. They recorded 215 litres per square metre over a period of 2 hours there. Then here in Germany, in Lower Saxony, there was a tornado, 50 houses that were damaged, with winds up to 250 kilometers an hour. In Rome, temperatures were very high. Tourists and the locals were suffering with the heat. The health ministry sent out red alerts for heat waves in several areas, and they recorded 48.8 degrees in Sicily. And then Cyprus had what officials called the worst wildfires in history. And then in southeastern Belgium, those floods again, 38 people died there, and there was widespread destruction from the flooding. There you go, a reminder of what happened this summer. Valérie, first question to you. How do you react when you see that, when you see those videos? How does it make you feel?
I just want to flag that everywhere around the world, we are increasingly living with the consequences of human-induced climate change. Not everything shown is in direct connection to human-induced climate change. Some parts are linked to weather variability, and our report provides our latest understanding of the effect of human influence on extreme weather events.
I think it's important, and we're going to be talking about that. I suppose the difference between weather and climate and how you understand those two, and the climate change component in these extreme events. I'll go to the mayor of Athens now, Kostas Bakoyannis. How prepared did you feel this summer when you had those extreme heat waves and those fires? What was that experience like when it comes to preparedness? Did you feel it was taken by surprise, in fact, by what happened?
Well, pictures are worth 1,000 words. So much is absolutely clear. And it's equally clear that we may think that we are ready, but we are never ready enough. This is a conclusion that was drawn by the IPCC report. All the commitments that were undertaken that stem from the Paris Accords, and including the European Union ambitious goals, the Fit for 55 ambitious goals, again, are not sufficient to meet the criteria of global warming as we speak. So clearly, we need to do more, and we need to do more at a quicker pace. Athens, as we speak, is a city that is building its resilience, it's building on mitigation, and it's investing in the future. Now, I understand that this is something that's not business as usual for politicians, because it necessitates two things. Number one, that we don't just think about the upcoming election, but about the generations to come. And number two, that we learn to listen to science, that we actually put facts, figures, transparency, and the truth over partisanship and politics.
Well, I'm reminded of one of the comments that we've had, actually, and thank you for those of us who are sending in the comments and questions and things beforehand, and please feel free to do so now, from Tom Jennings on Twitter, who said the short-term cost of climate action will be dwarfed by the long-term costs. Samantha, you're really at that interface. What's your experience now, and how do you react to what's happening at the moment? There's, let's say, the climate politically and scientifically that we're in now.
Sure. So I think one of the key things that we need to bear in mind is that resilience to past and current events is a prerequisite to future resilience. And as we saw in the video you showed at the beginning of the show, we're clearly not very resilient to current extreme events. As we saw, and as Valerie mentioned, there are many, many other events around the world. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that the World Economic Forum releases a global risk report every single year. And the top risk this year was highlighted as extreme weather by likelihood, whereas the top risk by impact, the second top risk by impact was climate action failure. So the fact that we have extreme weather and climate action failure as, in the top one or two events by either likelihood or impact really suggest, as the mayor of Athens mentioned, that this political awareness of what we need to do and building upon the scientific assessment as published recently by the IPCC is very, very critical.
Robert, one of the questions that we've had is saying, I know, and it sounds like almost a very simple question, but I suppose it's also a very complicated one too. Will extreme events become more extreme with climate change? Are we going to have to reset what we call extreme? Because what we just saw, we would call extreme. Those floods we saw in Germany, we would call extreme. Nearly 50 degrees in Southern Europe, we would call extreme. Do we need to reset that and think this is actually now going to become very normal?
I think we have to realize that climate change has already changed the intensity and the frequency of some of these extremes, such as the ones you were mentioning and the ones we have witnessed in Europe. So we are currently at 1 degree, and if the climate change continues, these extremes will essentially increase with the degree of warming that we, with the same amount of degree of warming that we have experienced. So for 2 degrees, we will have more, for instance, many more and more intense extremes, such as we have seen in Europe.
Did you see the announcements from the UN body that's behind the Paris Agreement on Friday, basically saying that the current contributions that we expect to see, at least so now, where we are now in terms of reductions, take us to a warming of 2.7 degrees. What is that world like? Well,
what we know is that if in the case that the emissions stay still, like this report has kind of predicted, then we will go to 2 degrees by 2050, basically. And in that case, we are pretty convinced, we are pretty actually confident that extremes will change and more extremes will occur, and actually in every single region of the world. So it's not just Europe, it's everywhere. And for many types of extremes and many types of other changes, such as in the snow cover, in the coastal, in the coastal extremes as well, in the in many types of events. So countries will have to deal with with the concurrence of several types of changes like that.
We had a question from Tajamul Siddiq, who's saying he wants to know how we as individuals, what we as individuals can do to make our environment safe. Kostas, if in Athens, for example, what can you say to the people in Athens about looking after their environment? What can they do on a house to house, street by street, community by community level?
Number one, it's a brave new world. Number two, 70% of CO2 emissions around the world actually come from cities. And that's despite the fact that cities only cover 3% of the world's surface. Number three, it's a global challenge, a global problem. However, it necessitates a local solution, a local response. So that means actually building bottom up. Let me give you a couple of examples. It could be something as small as a pocket park that may not change a city, but it could well change a neighborhood. Or it could be something as big as investing in our urban lungs. Whatever it is, must be very, very clear about the fact that every decision we take, small, medium, or big, must have the climate change, or to be more exact, the climate crisis at its heart.
Are people coming to you and saying, how can I kind of climate proof my house? How can I make my building, my school, or whatever, resilient?
In full transparency, I think it's a much harder pill for political leaders to swallow than it is for people, than it is for communities. Especially amongst the young, there is an increased awareness, there is a maturity, and there is actually a drive, a thirst to do something about it. So at the end of the day, it's about betting on the young and about moving forward.
Anybody else on the panel got any examples about kind of practical approaches, I suppose, which seems to be what that question was driving at? Sam?
Yeah, well, I guess that goes beyond the realm of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. But I think first and foremost, I think make yourself aware, educate yourself of what the risks are to your local community. So the IPCC is freely available. All of the data that Copernicus provides is freely available as well. And we have ready-made explorers that you can zoom into your local area to understand not only the weather and climate that you may have over the next few months or years, but also longer term into the future. I think is really critical to have these conversations to understand what other people are doing, and maybe that changes your consideration of what's viable for you and your family.
Yeah, absolutely. Get on top of the facts, which is something that is very interesting, and we can do now with this atlas that the IPCC came out with, which I was exploring and playing around with. But for those who aren't familiar, Valerie, can you tell us a bit about it?
Sure, and exactly to your question, I think what matters is to understand the links between the causes, how our emissions of greenhouse gases affect warming levels, and then how warming levels affect where you live, characteristics of the climate where you live, trends, extremes. And for that, we have released an interactive atlas where you can navigate for large regions, for instance, the Mediterranean part of Europe, or Western Central Europe, or Northern Europe. And you can look at various outlooks in the future, depending on the time horizon. The next 20 years, the middle of the century, the end of the century, you can look at various warming levels or various scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions, and then specific variables that matter where you live, including extreme temperature, for instance. And this atlas has had already an impressive success, and it's a way to facilitate the ownership of climate information that scientists have assessed and released by people who have an interest through where they live, decision makers, engineers in different sectors that need that information to enhance the resilience of the sector where they work.
Yeah, I must say, I encourage everybody to try having a go with this IPCC Atlas to be able to have a look at, as you say, your region. I mean, you can't go down to a sort of town level or village level, but you can look at lots of different parameters and try and understand what the future holds. Question for the mayor from Frank. Thank you for that question. He says that he loves Athens, such a beautiful place. How is Athens? How are the people of Athens already adapting to extreme weather, especially the extreme heat? I mean, what did you see this summer? How are they dealing with it now?
I mean, first of all, following your latest question, we have to be very clear. Politics can be either about fear or about hope. So we cannot just beat people into submission. We cannot just wave the finger. We have to actually create a sense of a forward-looking future, which in the case of Athens, and I think also in the case of most urban centers, involves fair, equitable, sustainable, resilient cities and communities. And that's something that we are working for in Athens. The mega fires that we saw earlier didn't just happen in a vacuum. They were the result of a prolonged period of extreme heat, an extraordinary period of heat. We haven't seen one like that, like in decades. And of course, this period of heat also didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, there's, I think, a direct relationship between cause and effect with climate change. So what we're doing in Athens is that we're actually taking the initiative, and just a few weeks ago, in cooperation with the Atlantic Council, we moved forward with appointing the first chief heat officer in Europe. It's not just a symbolic gesture, because it also enables us and allows us to work and bring about tangible results. Again, let me be practical and speak with examples. A big water fountain, which we just set up a few months ago or a year ago, can actually lower the temperatures on a public square by 3 degrees. The fact that we're about to plant hundreds and hundreds and thousands of trees, which provide shade and also lower the temperatures, is important. Or the fact that we're actually investing in sustainable mobility. We actually use the methodology of tactical urbanism in one of our central avenues. And by actually limiting the numbers of cars, we were able to conclude that we saw a drop in CO2 emissions within this avenue that reaches 27%. So it's about actually moving step by step and making sure that there are real changes in people's quality of life.
Was it a shock to you, though? I mean, the experience that you had this year with those, I mean, the idea of having flames close to the city, fires close to the city, is that new for you?
Well, I've been in local government for more than 10 years. In my previous capacity, I served as head of region of central Greece, which actually involves the island of Evia, which was really badly hit by these mega fires. We have been battling fires for a few years now. Admittedly, not such big mega fires and not so many mega fires at the same time, but it's not something new to us. But it's important, I think, though, to understand it's not just the forest that was destroyed in Evia, for example. It's not just the environment, it's people's livelihoods. The whole local community was built around the environment, whether it's agriculture, whether it is tourism, whether it's forest economy. All this was lost, and it will probably take a generation to rebuild. So there's a clear sense of urgency now. This is not the theoretical exercise. This is the real world that we're talking about.
Absolutely, and I'm going to come to Robert and push you a bit more on the extremes, because we have seen some extremes in terms of temperature this year, getting close to 50 degrees down in Sicily. How do you see that, and are you in a situation where you're thinking, it could get to 50, it could get to 52, it could get to 53 degrees pretty soon, and at what point do we say that's just not livable?
I think we have seen this year several cases. Actually, we have the Sicily case, of course, which brought the new European record of temperature of 48.8. But we also have seen at 50 degree north, it's our latitudes in Central Europe or Northern Europe, in British Columbia, 50 degrees also. So what we have seen at the moment, what we are witnessing actually is new records beaten by far. For British Columbia, it was by 5 degrees. Usually records are beaten by 1 degree or 2 degrees maybe, or half a degree, but not 5. So this is actually very worrying, and it also tells us that jumps like that in temperature records can happen everywhere. They can happen in Central Europe, they can happen in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe. And
what are the implications of that? I mean, in terms of people who are in government, what can they do?
I think this is pretty clear. We have to prepare for records way above what they used to be, which is what we witness at the moment, and we get to be prepared to that.
We had a survey actually that we did online on Euronews, asking people whether they thought their community was well prepared to face extreme events, and 53.8% said their community was completely unprepared, and 38% said their community was insufficiently prepared, which makes me think about one of the other questions we've had, which was about the floods in Germany. The person saying the power of the heavy rain there was extraordinary. Should every town and city that has a river going through it now start to think about that and say, that's going to happen to me soon, and how can they prepare for that?
Well, if I can answer, I'm not sure we can say this can happen to me soon, but this is certain, because we cannot predict exactly where this will occur. What we know is that the intensity of such rainfalls, extreme rainfalls, are very localized, but in general, they increase of about 7% per degree of warming, of regional warming. So this is this doesn't seem extraordinary high as an increase, but it could be sufficient to create huge damages when it falls on a very specific areas, such as what happened this year in these rivers. I think
can we confidently say that what happened in Germany was a climate change thing, or you know, was that a demonstration of climate change, what happened there, or not really?
It was a combination of natural variability and a push from climate change, because we have seen such intensities of a bit lower. It was clearly a record for the region, and it was also intensity that were higher than records in Western Europe, but not so much higher. So it can happen, but we don't know where. When it happens at the wrong place where you are, it makes a lot of problems, like we've seen.
Absolutely, and they're still clearing up now, of course, and you know, it's going to cost a huge amount of money. One of the other questions we had, Sam, and I think this one plays into, you know, a lot of people's minds. There's somebody's asking, what's the risk of flooding and violent storms in my village? They don't say where my village is in this case, but can people get to that detail and sort of work through the data and say, okay, where I am, these are the risks I've got?
Well, I guess the short answer is yes and no. So we know with climate change that the atmosphere is warmer and wetter than it otherwise would have been. So that's clear. And as long as human-induced emissions continue, our atmosphere will be warmer, and therefore we'll be able to hold more moisture. And this leads to extreme events where the rainfall is more intense. So we know that trend is happening. In terms of understanding our existing risk, C3S, the Copernicus Climate Change Service, has products such as reanalysis, which looks at historical weather and climate. And this enables people to have a very good understanding of the weather that has occurred in the past. And if we understand what type of events have occurred in the past in your local area, then you have the ability to understand whether you are resilient to those events that have occurred in the past, and then look at where those thresholds are in your infrastructure to understand your future resilience. And I think in the German example, the weather attribution service showed that the impact of climate change was effectively changing the event in Germany from a 1 in thousands of years event to 1 in hundreds of years event. So therefore, the climate change impact in that particular event changed it by an order of magnitude. And if you're at the very edge of the threshold of infrastructure reliability or resilience, then that change from centuries to decades or decades to years really, really matters. And another thing that's really important to bear in mind is for the particular event in Germany, we had a very wet spring and summer. Many people, in Europe were in lockdown, so they will remember this year compared with last year. We didn't have the really nice spring that we had in 2020. So this means that the soil was already very, very moist. And that meant that flooding was more likely because the soil didn't have the soil and ground didn't have the ability to absorb any more moisture, which led to flash flooding. So when you're looking
find, though, that leaders, for example, are not taking into account that kind of detail, things like soil moisture levels, that they're just looking at the weather forecast in their phone and taking decisions perhaps not with the right information?
Exactly. So it's really critical to go back to your National Weather Service and say, I see this as the forecast, but tell me what's happened and what do I need to be aware of, and having that dialogue with the National Service to understand what your risk is.
Valerie, are people who are leaders, politicians, mayors, local mayors, are they reading your report as far as you're aware? Are they feeding back to you about it?
I hope so. And the authors of this report have been submerged with requests for presenting the main findings to various audiences in parliaments, in organizations of mayors of cities, but also to decision makers in the private sector who take very seriously the use of climate science information to inform their risk management strategies. And we were talking about cities. And what really matters is that it's not just a matter of human-induced climate change. Urbanization also interacts with that. We know that cities are associated with urban heat islands due to the geometry of the city or the materials that are used, which means there are possibilities to act in terms of changing the urbanization to limit the effects of more frequent heat waves due to a changing climate. And at the same time, urbanization also affects the flow of water, the runoff. And even if you have more intense rainfall events in a changing climate, you also have the possibility to act by limiting the level of warming and by the geometry of the cities and the role of wetlands, for instance, that can store extra water during such events. So we also cover that in this report, and I see a strong attention to anything related to possibilities for action. So this report has been focused on the physical science basis, but in beginning of next year, there will be further IPCC reports assessing the action options for adaptation and for mitigation, which are closer, in fact, to the needs of decision makers.
Kostas, does reading things like that IPCC report this summer keep you up at night, give you nightmares, thinking about floods or heat waves and how extreme it could get in your city?
What gives me absolute nightmares is that my children won't be able to live in the city, that it won't be a city that they will feel comfortable and safe in. I mean, think about the numbers, and this is where reports like the IPCC reports and data-driven tools like the Copernicus tool are extremely useful. The average temperature in Greece is expected to rise on average from 2.2 to 3.8 degrees. Now that's huge. That's absolutely huge. And this is a case where, and I'm trying to be as blunt about it as I can, of actually knowing that the light that we see at the end of the tunnel is a train that is coming to drive all over us. So we need to make the necessary decisions, and it's not just about the transnational political system. It's not just about the nation states. It's about the cities and local authorities. We are the catalysts in this process. And if there is one critique that I think can quite fairly be leveled on the European Union plan and the European Union Green Deal, is that it doesn't involve local authorities and cities. That is something that we are actually trying to make up through networks much like the C40 or other city networks, where it's not just about exchanging best practices and learning from each other. It's also about lobbying our governments and our transnational institutions to involve cities and actually start building alliances. After all, this is not an ideological or political issue, or it shouldn't be. It's a question. It's an issue of logic and reason.
I was interested in what you said earlier on about the Fit for 55 package from the European Commission not going far enough. You must be in a bit of a minority on that, because lots of the people in industry and politicians think it's pretty ambitious already, and that it's already ambitious compared to the rest of the world. What would you like to see?
Look, we have to be very clear about making a distinction between what we aspire for and what is feasible. What I said, and I think it was what I said, and I think it's actually quite fair, is that if you take the IPCC report conclusions, then it is clear that the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 don't go far enough, which means that we don't have any more time to lose. We cannot play any more games. We need to speed up, and we need to speed up on all levels. I mean, different countries may face different challenges. In the case of Greece, it could be heat. In the case of Germany, it could be the floods. Still, we all need to be very, very clear about our goals and actually about the roadmap which will allow us to reach these goals.
A question we've had from Innovation Spotlight, they call themselves. I don't know who that is. They're saying, should developing countries still have different rules, for example, for the number of CO2 emissions emitted than developed ones? Does somebody want to have a go at that question? Straying outside the IPCC Working Group 1 land there, but should there be different rules for different countries?
What I can just say is that if you want to limit global warming, the first condition is to go as fast as possible to globally net zero CO2 emissions. And every additional ton of CO2 you put in the atmosphere will add to further warming. And then you also need to limit the effect of other dimensions of human influence with a specific role for methane. That's something that's really clear from our report, with win-wins in terms of climate and air quality. That also matters for cities. And then the other questions are about ethics, considering historical emissions, the ability to act, the living standards. And there's a very clear literature that shows that giving clean energy access to those who are today's poorest will have very limited effect at the global scale in terms of emissions. So what really matters is reducing emissions of those who pollute most now.
Yeah, and that's where we're waiting still to hear, right, for the promises that are going to be made for Glasgow. How optimistic are you for a proper outcome, Valerie, from what happens in Glasgow? One where we can say this was decided, and the financing got to where it needed to go, and the ambition was there on the CO2 reduction.
I think it's not a matter of being optimistic or pessimistic. It's looking at what is on the table. So looking at nationally determined contributions, so the pledges in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we still miss those from most emerging economies. And those that are available imply emissions that would stagnate until 2030. And that's clearly not compatible with the pathways that are needed to limit warming well below 2 degrees or close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which are the goals of the Paris Agreement based on risk analysis.
What do you think? What's your best guess on the pathway that we're on? I mean, the report says that what came out on Friday was talking about 2.7 degrees by the end of the century.
So from a climate science perspective, it makes no sense to give one single number.
Right.
And the pledges, they are expressed only by 2030, and it's an iterative process where governments are supposed every 5 years to raise their ambition. So
how much does it matter though if it's 0.1 of a degree?
So we just have one scenario out of the 5 ones that we have assessed to look at future global warming levels, and one scenario, which is called SSP2 4.5, assumes that global emissions of greenhouse gases stagnate for a few decades before going down. In that case, we would overcome a level of warming of 2 degrees by 2050. Our best estimate would be around 2.7 plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And that margin is important because it reflects our current understanding of the response of the climate system, which is the result of multiple feedback loops. We have an uncertainty there, and the more warming we have, the more we add uncertainty, in fact. For instance, we know that the land, the ocean, they take up around 56% of our emissions today, and we know that their relative efficacy is reduced with further warming. It's hard to reduce that, to narrow that uncertainty. So it's important to stress that we have an uncertainty on the overall response of the climate system, and the more we shock it with our emissions, the outcome is, including, for instance, risks associated from compound rare events we've been talking about.
How much does 0.1 degree of a difference make in terms of our experience of what it's like as a human living on this planet? Is that enough to be something where we're going to say, okay, the 1.6 world is really very different to the 1.5 degree world?
I think we see clearly the effect of a few tens of degrees in terms of what has been observed so far. And looking at projections of regional and global climate, we see that for trends, we see that for the frequency and intensity of extreme events. We also see that in terms of irreversible, long-lasting consequences. For instance, sea level rise that matters so much for coastal regions in Europe and around the world.
Do you think the magnitude?
Do
you think sea level rise is a little bit is not talked about enough, actually, because it is, the numbers are going up and up and up all the time?
We've seen an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise since the 1990s due to the effect of the rising and expanding ocean. It's
3.7 millimeters per year now, according to
the melt of glaciers that you can see over your lifetime, and an increasing rate of loss of ice from Greenland and from Antarctica. And the part from Antarctica is our major source of uncertainty for the future. And what really matters is that with a rising sea level, it's not just a slow, gradual trend. It will also exacerbate the recurrence of extreme sea level events that can cause compound flood risks on coasts. If you have heavy rain on the coast and a storm surge at the same time, that risk increases when you have further warming and faster sea level rise as well. And as for other aspects, many of the decisions that are taken today are still done looking in the back mirror at the extreme sea level events that have been experienced in the past 100 years. But we are certain they will continue to change. And the purpose of our knowledge is to make that information available so that decisions made today can anticipate what will happen in the next decades or more.
Kostas, to what extent are these sea level issues taken very seriously in Greece?
I mean, of course, they're taken very seriously. On a national level right now, the government is moving forward with implementing a very ambitious, but I think realistic climate change plan. It's the first time that such a reform, because we're talking about a true reform, is actually taking place in the history of Greece. It's been tough because, as you know, we've been emerging from a long financial crisis, and then we were hit by the pandemic. But I'm actually heartened by the government's decisiveness and commitment to actually achieving these goals. There was an ECO 9 Med meeting in Greece just last Friday, where a statement, the Athens Declaration, actually underlined and reinforced these goals for the Mediterranean. So I think that we should actually feel quite optimistic about the years to come. I mean, clearly there's been a mentality shift in the minds of decision makers, and clearly I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we're actually living through a paradigm shift at the same time.
You really think so? You really think it's that big?
I'm at least talking about Europe. I think one can safely make this working hypothesis. I hope that other countries will join. Much will depend, of course, on who will actually come to Glasgow in the first place. I hope that big countries, including China, will be represented at the highest level. It's very, very important that that's understood, that this is not just a rich world's problem. It's actually a global challenge, and we don't want to create climate apartheids around the globe.
One of the questions actually we had was regarding heat waves in the Caribbean, which I admit I really don't know very much about. Valerie, can you help us on that one? Microphone.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, with a further warming, we expect more frequent, more intense heat waves, not only over land, but also marine heat waves. And thinking of small islands like in the Caribbean, the recurrence of marine heat waves is also critically important for marine ecosystems and those who depend on them for local fisheries or for instance, coral-based tourism. And I also want to flag that in our report regarding the Caribbean, we also provide the latest knowledge regarding a decrease in precipitation that can increase the recurrence and severity of droughts as well, which is also important to be prepared for, to anticipate for, especially for small islands where water management is challenging sometimes.
So a Caribbean island, which I would expect to have no problem at all with water, it could be in a situation where they're facing droughts.
At least the observations and the projections suggest a decline in seasonal precipitation that can increase the likelihood of droughts, especially droughts that can affect agricultural activities. And as you know, we spoke about a warmer climate that intensifies the water cycle. It's not just extreme rainfall. It's because a warmer climate enhances evaporation and transpiration from soils, and therefore when there's a heat wave, it can exacerbate the occurrence of drought in addition to the precipitation trends. That's really important for the Caribbean islands. It's also important for the Mediterranean area as well.
In fact, we're going global with our questions because this one's concerning Australia. Could you comment on how Australia will be adversely impacted because of weather extremes in rural and coastal city areas? Again, my program Climate Now tends to focus a lot on what happens in Europe because we're Euronews, but maybe I don't know whether any of the climate scientists here would like to talk about that. What can we expect for Australia?
Maybe I can comment. I think Australia is a specific continent which will be hit by specific extremes such as heat waves and fire weather. Actually, fire is probably the most expectable, unfortunately, outcome of climate change in Australia. And we have seen last year the effect of extreme heat waves, how they could trigger mega fires and with huge areas burnt because of vegetation essentially and drought on top of that last year. So I think Australia is very vulnerable, is very exposed, to such fires. But I want to come back to the, if I may, to Caribbeans. I think it goes also. It's also for all tropical regions. Tropical climate uses to have temperatures that vary in a very narrow range. It's not changing like it changes with seasons in Europe, for instance. And therefore, the climate change is also is driving the climate completely off its normal range, but completely off, meaning that the highest temperatures, the lowest temperatures now are higher than the highest they were before. So this is of extreme importance for many consequences, in particular ecosystems and societies, because the change is driving the climate completely off. And this occurs in Caribbean, of course.
Sam, to what extent does the kind of, we talked about Europe having this variability in the seasons and things, to what extent does that mask things or confuse us here as Europeans about understanding what climate change really means for us? Because lots of people, I live in France and went to the UK on holiday, amazingly, and of course it was like 19 degrees and drizzle. I didn't feel like climate change was beating down my door this year, I must say. To what extent is that kind of an issue when it comes to trying to get this message across?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and understanding the difference between climate variability and climate change is often lost in latitudes where you do have a large seasonal variability. And I think this is one of the challenges we see in the Arctic as well. The Arctic, we know from the scientific evidence from the IPCC report that it's warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the world. And we've seen heat waves this year in the Arctic. I think last year, one of your reports showed that an area in Siberia was over 38 degrees in summer. So we're seeing these real extremes, but there is that variability between winter and summer. I think one of the challenges that we face, and C3S, I guess, as a climate service covers this in our annual reporting and our monthly reporting, is that just because we're on this trend of a warming world, it doesn't mean next month will automatically be warmer than this month. And 2020, particularly for Europe, was an unusual year. So Europe was the warmest year that we've ever had, and it was 0.4 degrees warmer than the next 5 warmest years, which have all occurred in the last decade. So again, we can see that trend. And one of the reasons why last year was so unusual is because it was the autumn and the winter that were particularly warm. And the winter record, it was 3.4 degrees above the 30-year record that Valerie had mentioned before, this reference period that we use to understand climate change versus climate variability. And it was about 1.4 degrees warmer than the previous warmest winter. So again, we can see from records like that it's not just having a hot summer, but it's having these mild winters that really impact growing seasons, viability of ecosystems, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I live in a region where they produce wine, and they're 50% down this year because of the frosts, in fact, that they had at the start of this year in April, because the seasons had shifted by, 2 days per decade, Robert, is that right?
Well, it depends on the region, but it's usually a bit more. Actually, what was really striking this year was not so much the frost by itself. It was a deep frost indeed, but it was the warmth in March, which triggered actually the growing seasons, and which made the vegetation exposed to such frost, which can happen in April still.
Yeah, no, and it was an unpleasant event, and I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for, let's say, the people where I live, in the part of France I live in, that climate change is happening, and people, I think, when I speak to my friends, have understood this concept that the growing season has changed and how that worked. I'm going to go to Athens now. Do the people of Athens understand climate change? Do you think? Do they understand it concerns them?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it. I mentioned the young earlier. The young are our natural allies moving forward. And I think this new generation that's upcoming, is who we can actually count on. The young are much more involved, are much more sensitive, are much more aware, and at the same time, they're much more ambitious and they're much more driven. I mean, one gets this sense clearly walking on the sidewalks of Athens. There is a dynamism in the streets, and whoever underestimates this dynamism politically or socially or economically, I think will do so at his or her peril.
I'm sure, absolutely, and yeah, there definitely feels like there's something happened this year in well, maybe this year, but certainly in the last few months in terms of the conversations that people are having now about climate change. They're moving on, and I think people are looking out for data. And I've got a question here from Born, and I think it's a good one, and it's in people's minds too, which is, does the Earth go through cycles with extreme climates and temperatures? Does that kind of stuff happen anyway? And you do actually talk about that in your report, Valerie, don't you?
Well, basically, we look at all the wealth of information that is available. So we look at the history of the Earth's climate on long time scales, and we show how different current warming is compared to past natural variations. We also look at what are called modes of variability, which result from the interplay between, let's say, ocean currents and winds, and how they affect regional climate. And these natural phenomena need to be taken into account so that you get prepared for the full range of what can happen from natural variability and human-induced climate change together. We also stress the importance of being prepared for what would happen in the case of a major volcanic eruption. We know it happened in the past. We know it can happen in the future. It would have a short-lived effect, but that goes against the warming trend. And it's therefore really important to use that information to be prepared. And would like to come back to the point from the mayor of Athens. I can tell you that many students everywhere are reading the IPCC reports. It's amazing. And they have very accurate questions. And I think that's a reason why policymakers should read the summary for policymakers. Because if they don't, they will be disconnected from the young generation of voters who are developing their skills, not just awareness, but skills in how to approach a changing climate.
A question we've just had from Zhu Am, which is going back to the conversation we were having about crops. So we're jumping around here, but thanks for the questions. They're great. What will happen to crops before they get accustomed to this kind of new weather? Robert, do you have any kind of insight on that? How are plants adapting?
Well, plants are not adapting by themselves with a sufficient speed. What will happen is that basically for crops, the yield of the crop should be stagnating or going down. That's what's going to happen basically. In some cases, though, we have extreme droughts or heat waves, and the crops can die also from this extreme heat. It depends, of course, the threshold depends on the crop. But basically, what will happen is that we will have to adapt our agriculture to the climate change, to conditions, to the new conditions, basically.
Yeah. I've had powerful experiences with some of the reports, and have a look at euronews.com/climate now to see some of the reports about this topic, because it is absolutely fascinating, and people on the ground living through it. I've had a question from John Watson. I'm not quite sure what he's driving at, but he says, why aren't the oceans an important aspect of the Paris Agreement? Oceans are only mentioned once in the Paris Agreement, and yet oceans contribute most to extreme climates. They also do a good job of absorbing lots of CO2. Valerie, what do you think he's driving at?
I think there has been a focus on the role of the ocean following the special IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere in 2019. This was a major topic at the COP25 in Chile and Spain. And the UN have launched the Ocean Decade as well to raise attention on what can be done on the policy side to enhance also the resilience of the ocean ecosystems. And the point is really well made, because the ocean absorbs more than 90% of the extra heat due to our emissions of heat-trapping gases, and it makes climate change irreversible. The ocean absorbs around 23% of the CO2, but it's causing shifts in habitats in the ocean. The ocean is acidifying, and by being warmer, the ocean waters mix less well, which and causes a loss of oxygen in the hundreds upper meters of the ocean, with major implications for marine life. And that's invisible for most people. So the report we've released has a specific chapter focused on the ocean and places a strong emphasis on these aspects because they're really important for a number of risk management strategies as well.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing to dig into, learning more about what's happening with the oceans. I've loved all of the reports that I've done in those areas because the people are so passionate about it. And it, as you say, it is a bit hidden from us. We don't go there and go in it. And and so we don't know actually that much about it. Another question I've had, we're going to run out of time soon, but this is from Erodus, who's asking, hypothetically, if the climate situation worsens in the next 5-10 years, I don't think that's hypothetical, it's probably going to happen. What hard repercussions can be predicted for metropolitan areas around the world? Sam, would you like to have a go at that one?
Sure, I can certainly start. So I guess the really important thing to bear in mind is that climate impacts are different depending on where you are in the world, and the scientific evidence of how the climate will change in the future is also different. So we know, for example, in Northern Europe, Europe in general is going to get warmer, but in Northern Europe, it's going to get wetter, particularly in winter, whereas in the Mediterranean and North African latitudes, it's going to get drier. So this is going to, and it's going to get hotter. So this dryness and additional heat is going to compound. Our knowledge, and I'm kind of answering for Valerie here, in the tropics is a lot more mixed. And again, it's the same with the polar regions. Our understanding of how climate change will impact the Arctic is much more certain than the Antarctic, where it's more mixed again. But
so are we going to get to the point though there where southern European cities become unlivably hot in the summertime, and where some northern European cities, like we saw London with some amazing flooding earlier this year, are just going to be hit over and over again by that kind of event? Is that the sort of split you can imagine, you could say?
There's certainly that possibility, but of course it's dependent on political action, and it's dependent on what climate adaptation and mitigation strategies take place at city level, at regional level, and at national level to adapt those cities to the new climate normal. And I think that's one of the strengths of C3S as well. We can listen to the users and we can look at particular sectors, whether it's understanding how climate change will impact your city or your particular crop or energy generation or whatever it may be, and provide support on the data that we have available, which is not only climate data for the future, but also climate data of the past, so that you can look at your risk profile and then build your climate adaptation and mitigation strategies accordingly.
I'm interested in you using the word risk there, and I would like to hear again from Athens about how you're evaluating risks and whether you're changing your early warning systems and evolving with them because of what's happening now.
Well, you heard what Samantha said. She actually said that the risk depends on political action. She actually said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there are a number of scenarios, and it's up to us to choose which scenario we're going to experience in the years to come. I think that is a key point of this discussion. And that's actually a message that's optimistic, because climate change may be human-induced, but also it's up to humans to solve the problem. And I think that is the main takeaway that I would like to stress and I would like to underline. And of course, to answer your question, in Athens, we understand that this is a dynamic process. It's constantly evolving. It's not black and white. So we're constantly trying to improve ourselves and become better. And which means that we make decisions based on evidence and data. It means that we listen to scientists, and it also means that we remain unwaveringly committed to our long-term goals.
It has been absolutely fascinating listening to the scientists, in fact, today. We're about to run out of time. So maybe a final word from Valerie on how you assess the situation now, a few weeks after the publication of your report, and looking forward to COP in Glasgow.
It's just to say that I hope the huge interest for the latest state of knowledge will trigger action. In our report, we show if we reduce emissions at the global scale of major greenhouse gases, we would see in a few years effects in terms of atmospheric composition, of air quality, but it would take around 20 years to see the effects in terms of slowing down the rate of global warming. And it's just the word we want to prepare for the young generations of today. And following the points that have been discussed, I just want to bring to the attention of your audience the fact that there are regional synthesis fact sheets on the ipcc.ch website, the interactive atlas, and invites them to get to that information that is relevant for them and help share that knowledge.
Robert, can you share some of your thoughts, some of your concerns and hopes? Microphone.
Well, my concern is the same as Valerie, essentially, but I would add that we are seeing full screen climate change now, and we are seeing only a bit of it if we don't stop the train at the moment. So my message would be to listen to science and please put the brakes and stop the train.
Samantha?
Yeah, I think we're almost in a fortunate position at the moment in that we have the latest scientific assessment available. We have a political process that is coinciding with that. So we have the ability to see ambitious action. But as Valerie mentioned, I would urge all listeners to, if this is a priority issue for them, to make that publicly known to their elected representatives so that they're going into these conferences. And as the mayor said, that it is not just national representation, it is regional and local representation as well, because the impacts are different. And I think it's also really important to bear in mind what Valerie and Robert have mentioned, there is these compound events that are really critical. So we can't just focus on heat waves or fires or extreme rainfall events, but it is really that they interact with each other. So we need to be resilient against all of them that are going to impact our local region if we are to have a resilient society in the future.
It has been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I would love to carry on with the conversation, but we've already overrun slightly, so I have to stop it there. Huge thanks to the Mayor of Athens, Kostas Bakayannis. Really excellent to have you on the panel. Samantha Burgess, the Deputy Director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. Thank you very much for being with us as well. Robert Vota, who's a specialist in extreme weather events and the Director of the Institut Pierre-Simon Laplace in Paris. Thank you for being with us, and to Valerie Masson-Delmotte, co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 1. Amazing group of scientists and politicians joining us. Thank you very much for watching, and have a look at euronews.com/climate now, where you can learn more about these topics, follow the news, and hopefully engage with us on social media. Let us know your questions, and we'll have another one of these live events very soon, I'm sure. I'll see you soon.